kind of found. It allows you to create things with your imagination.
Okay.
That's just all. Any other thing you need to see? Like
Yeah, I think I missed what you
allows you
said.
to create things with your imagination.
Okay. Yeah. All right. You
For
said
that,
tech. Yeah, you said tech was on the side. What was the original career?
aerospace engineering.
Airspace engineering. Okay, cool.
That's just all.
That sounds
Any other thing you
interesting.
need to see?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I missed what you
allows you
said.
to create things with your imagination.
Okay. Yeah. All right. You
For
said
that,
tech. Yeah, you said tech was on the side. What was the original?
sorry, please. There's a repetition.
Yeah, I think Aris is still live streaming, so I think we have a feedback.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I set up the live stream, so now you're all live.
Okay, but I think it's good now. Cool. All right. So Favor, you can go ahead now. Thank you so much, Bright.
Hi everyone. My name is Favor Harrison. I'm a software engineer. I've been one for the past 7, 8 years. And I'm trying to change that. So this is me exploring basically and trying to get the feel of the Nigerian tech space. I'm joining from Lagos. That's where I am right now. So thank you.
That sounds good. Yeah, the right place. Thank you. We're going to take one more, then we would start, and then halfway into the workshop, we'll continue. We'll do a few more intro. Okay, so Halima Adelaja, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Hi, Halima.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm currently on the move. I don't know. I've not been following. I just joined so that I'll be able to join again when I settle down. Sorry. So I don't know what you're talking about. I just said my name.
Oh, yeah, we're just doing like a short 30 seconds intro. Your name, your background, and where you are joining us from.
Okay. My name is Adela Jalima. I'm joining from Yaba, Lagos. And okay, front end oh yeah, front end is my stack.
Okay. And you're joining from Lagos, right?
Yes, Yaba, Lagos.
Perfect. Cool. We have 3 minutes and we can get started. So I'm just going to how many people do we have online now? We've got 13 people, which is relatively fair. All right, so we can get started with this number.
We're also reach out to other people that signed up because more people signed up, but maybe they were waiting for and they couldn't get access. So we're going to reach out so we'll have more people join. Yeah.
Okay. Is there a hub, maybe like a chat or just email, right? Where we can or should I tweet the link?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should do that. Yeah.
Okay, so if I'm at the same link you sent to me on WhatsApp, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me just tweet it.
I also did the tweet, so if you can retweet it, so
okay, perfect.
we can get more people on the live stream.
Okay. Cool. All right, I just posted a tweet as well. Let's get started. I'm still hearing a little bit of echo. I don't know where it's coming from.
It's from us. Sorry.
Okay. All right.
Chris. Okay.
Yes.
So, yeah, you can kick off. Midway, we might have to drop off because we have to go to the venue for my workshop. Right?
Yes, no problem.
But Aris is
okay.
going to be here. In case you need anything.
All right, that's fair. That makes sense. Cool. All right, folks. My name is Christian Wamba, and I'm a senior developer advocate at AWS. I wanted to teach this workshop not necessarily to show you all how a URL shortener works. Let me see. I don't know what you guys are seeing on screen. Let me pin my face. Okay, cool. So I wanted to show you all not necessarily how a URL shortener works, but what the tools I use to build up in 2020, to build apps in 2023. Like what is my stack as someone that works at AWS and have first-hand experience with customers that have varying demands and varying needs. What do we use and what do we recommend you use from all of our experiences? And that disclaimer, the fact that I'm at AWS honestly does not bias what I'm going to show you today, because I'm going to show you a few tools that I genuinely love, and even when I work on side projects, those are the things I use. So by the end of this workshop, you're going to go away with one, the tools that are in my tool stack, and as well as most of my colleagues. And secondly, you get the added advantage of knowing how a URL shortener works and how to build one. Cool. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen and we'll take, the host disabled participant screen sharing.
Let me do it.
Okay.
I did it, I think.
Okay.
Cool.
I will take over, so if you go away, I will be here.
Okay, thank you, Aris. Yeah.
No problems.
Perfect. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Great. So the first thing we should do is take a look at how a URL shortener is designed. What's this system designed for a URL shortener? I've stripped it down, removed everything, including things like authentication and whatever that might distract us. Oh, why
I'm
am
gonna
I
sorry, I'm muting the people.
Okay, cool.
Go ahead. I will be muting the people.
Joining. All right, that makes sense. Okay, cool. So it's a very simple architecture I have here because I've stripped it down to just very simple basics. There are two stages. The first stage is to shorten the URL, and the second stage is to lengthen a URL. And to shorten the URL, what we are going to do is give a URL to a client. In this case, it's going to be your browser. And the URL is going to call an API, and that API is going to generate a shorter version of that URL, and it's going to write both the long URL and the short code for that URL to a database. And then it will return the short URL to the client in case you as the user want to copy the short URL and reuse it. And to lengthen the URL, what we're going to do is that you have to go to supply that short URL to the client. And the client would have a dynamic endpoint that handles shortcodes. And it's going to grab that shortcode, go to the database, look for that particular shortcode. And when it finds it, it will come back to the API. But instead of going back to the client like we did when we're shortening, it would redirect to the long URL that you stored in your database. Now, more specifically, how the shorten API works is that it takes a long URL, it generates a random shortcode, and then it redirects it writes the shortcode to the long URL and then redirects back to the client. I'm going to open the chat and make sure that what I've just walked you all through makes absolute sense. If you're confused, please drop a message in the chat. Like I said, this is a workshop, it's not a conference. So the point of a workshop is to be small and to be interactive. So feel free to say something in the chat if what I've just said now doesn't make sense, because I'm here to teach you something from beginning to the end and not just dump a bunch of information on you. Okay? All right, so is the shortcode same as the short? Yeah, so what I'm just going to do is store the shortcode, not the short URL. You will see how I'm going to use the shortcode to just attach to, the shortcode is just something I'm going to attach as a dynamic parameter to my actual domain that will then redirect to the long URL. We'll see the implementation details in a second, okay? Cool. Jumping back, the next thing we need to do is to actually create the API and the database. We're going to do both of these using a tool called AWS Amplify. And Amplify basically makes it very easy for you to model a database, and it's going to immediately take the database and convert it to an API. We're going to see this in a practical in a practical example, but what I wanted to just keep in mind is that you would not have to write the business logic for your code. All you just need to do is most of the time just implement the API or talk to the API from the front end setup. Now that said, we need to jump to AWS console, which you can get by going to...
I have a question.
Yes.
So I think I'm confused with the shortened URL and the shortcode.
Yes, so that was what I was saying, that the shortcode is just an ID that is going to represent a URL. And what's going to happen is that we're going to store that ID alongside the long URL in the database. Then when a user makes a request, let's say you make a request to localhost 3000 / the shortcode, let's say it's a 5-character word. What I'm going to do is our app would grab this as a dynamic parameter and then make a request to the database to find the shortcode that matches this parameter. When it finds that shortcode, it's then going to ask the database, what long URL version are you related to? Then when we grab that long version, we'll just redirect to that long URL. So you're going to see this in practice, but this is just an overview of what exactly is going on behind the scene.
So the short URL is this localhost 3000 / the code, right?
Exactly. Yeah, this is going to be the short URL, but the short code is JFJDF.
Okay.
Perfect. All right. So the next thing we need to do is, like I said, go to your AWS console, and to get to AWS console, go to a new tab and type console.aws.amazon.com. And then search for AWS Amplify. When you find it, you need to click on it to open it. And then click the new app drop down and choose View an app. And then we can give the app a name. Let's call it URL Shortener. I'm just going to add the number 3 beside the name because I've been doing tests and I don't want any of the previous ones to conflict with what we're creating now. Then I can go ahead and click Confirm Deployment. And what AWS is going to do is that it's going to set up an Amplify project for us in a few seconds. And while this is happening, I'm just going to check the chat real quick and be sure that there aren't any more confusions. Okay. So if you have any confusion on AWS Amplify, even though we're still starting, please feel free to let me know now while we're still setting up, and I can answer more questions. By the way, if you've heard of AWS Amplify, can you let me know by posting an emoji in the chat? if you've heard, you don't need to have used it, just heard of it, or like just came across it in an article or saw it in a YouTube video. Shagun, John, and have any of you actually like tested it or used it in the past? Okay, Grace have used it to deploy a React code. Cool. Well, Grace, I guess you're in for a treat because today we're not deploying a front-end code. We're actually going to do more of a back-end, have more of a back-end experience. All right. Cool. So we have our project set up. We have our Amplify project set up. And the next thing we need to do is to click on this Launch Studio button, which is going to take us entirely outside of AWS. And it's going to give us a fresh, brand new dashboard that helps us manage this particular URL Shortener app. So you can see from the title, it says URL Shortener, and we have the staging environment. And this is an entire dashboard where you can start doing things like setting up data, protecting your data with authentication, adding some files, writing custom serverless functions, dealing with your GraphQL API, REST API, analytics, predictions with machine learning, and all of those cool things. But for now, and of course, for the designers in the room, we have the UI features as well, where you take a Figma component or when you take a Figma project, give it to Amplify, and it would convert them to React project. But for today, we're just going to focus on the data part of Amplify because I just have 1 hour to show you something cool, so I can show you all of this. If I click on data, I can add a new table by clicking the Add Model button. We're going to call this table URL. Now, we need a field to store our long URL, and we also need one more field to store our short URL. Now, from your question, Grace, the long field is going to store the actual long URL at the end of the day, and the short field is just going to store the short code that's going to represent this URL. Now, that's said and done, we can go ahead and click the Save and Deploy button, and then confirm deployment by clicking the Deploy button. Now, here's where things get interesting. What Amplify is going to do, Amplify itself is not an infrastructure. Instead, it is kind of an arsenal of infrastructures that we use to build apps. And the powerful thing about Amplify is that it's not reinventing the wheel. What it's doing is that it's going back to AWS to say, hey, AWS, give me the best tool you have for databases, for fast databases. Give me the best tool you have for building APIs. Let me use those tools to create an API for this customer. So you can see it's showing you that from this animation. And what it's doing is that it's talking to AWS Amplify, is creating, first of all, it's creating an AppSync project, which we're going to go behind this scene and look at this thing. It's creating an AppSync API, and it's creating a DynamoDB database, and it's going to create a table in that database, and that table is going to be turned into an API, into a CRUD API using AWS AppSync. And because of all of these things happening behind the scene, if you take a look at your deployment logs, you can see that it's actually going to take a few minutes for it to finish. So what we're going to do instead, while we're waiting for it to finish deploying this model and the API and the database, is to go ahead and set up a next project while we're waiting for it. And to set up a next project, go to the terminal, run npx digit, and we're going to create a project based on a starter template I've created for you all, which you can, if you just run this command, you would get a brand new Next.js project with all of the dependencies set up and the UI we need for this project as well. So we're going to run npx digit Christian /URL Shortener, and we're going to grab the starter branch. We're going to name this project URL Shortener 3. And if you hit enter, this is going to clone this branch, the startup branch, and if we cd into the project, cd into URL Shortener 3, we can open this project in a code editor. And from the code editor, we can open our terminal and run npm install to install the dependencies. Now, if I go to the package.json file to see the dependencies we just installed, primarily we just need to care about nano ID and validator. The rest are just React and the UI related dependencies. Now, nano ID is just the library we're going to use to generate shortcodes, and validator is a library that is going to help us make sure that the URL the user supplies to our UI is valid. Now we can go ahead and run this app. Then go to localhost 3000. And you can see we have a fancy UI where we can put in a URL, and that URL is going to get converted to a short URL. If you go back to the code editor and look at the index.js file, which is what we just saw in the browser, basically I just have an input and a little UI feature here that shows you the long URL that you've just supplied, as well as the converted short URL. Now, everything for now is hard-coded, so we're going to go ahead and start building out this URL shortener. I'm going to pause for questions before we go ahead and continue. So leave questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask questions if you need to. I'm sure the 20 people in this room does not agree with everything I've just done now. So if you disagree, if you find something confusing, if you feel lost, if I had moved so fast, because I have a tendency of doing that, please let me know and I can address that.
We have a question from Ade Fisayo.
Okay, on YouTube?
No, it is here, but Ade Fisayo, can you tell us what you do?
Hi, thank you very much, Christian. Sorry, please, I have a question. This setting up with Nox.js, right? Does it come with Next? Okay, Next.js.
Yes.
It came with, you've already designed this before, because looking at the package.json, seeing Tailwind, I just thought to run it and all those basic dependency. Does he has it already? So I mean, I was a bit lost. And sorry about that. And then this AWS configuration, is this shortening of URL basically AWS dependent? Like, is it like DevOps generally?
No. So yeah, let me start with your first question. Okay, the first question is setup. Now, what I've just done with the setup is, normally if you want to create a next app, you would run npx create next app, and then you give the app a name, and you create next app would scaffold a brand new Next.js project for you. But I don't want to waste your time and start styling a project on a 1-hour workshop. So I had to move faster. And what I had done was create the styles with Tailwind, just the style, just the UI, and then push that to GitHub. Now, this npx digit command is just a git clone with the added feature of removing the .git folder after it clones it, so that way it becomes your project entirely and you wouldn't have to care about my git history. So that's the reason why I've done this. But literally, you can just run git clone https github.com/christian1/URL shortener. When you clone it, check out the starter branch, and you would have the same thing. The only thing is that you will have my git history, so you might have to then do rm-rf.git to remove that git history. So that is all of that step is what I skipped for you by just running npx digit. That's one. Then for the second question about AWS. Now, the whole point of this workshop was to tailor content developers, not to DevOps engineers. So whatever I'm showing you here, if you're a DevOps engineer, I don't want to be harsh and say you're in the wrong room, but technically that's what it means, because AWS Amplify is a tool in as much as it is owned by AWS, and this is a narrative we're helping our customers understand every day. In as much as it's a tool owned by AWS, it doesn't necessarily equal to a DevOps tool. Instead, it's a developer tool that we want developers to use, just like the way they would use Netlify, or they would use Vercel, or they would use Supabase, or they would use Prisma. Instead of using any of these tools where you have to combine them together, Amplify is one tool that has all of the features in one box. So it's not necessarily a DevOps tool, it's a developer infrastructure that allows you to build an app without having to worry about the details of setting up a database and writing SQL queries and writing APIs from scratch and all of those things. All these things are set up for you automatically once you just create and model the database. So let me see if there is any other question. Okay, cool. I hope that answered your question, by the way, but let's move on, and I can always come back and address more questions if that was not clear. Now, back to our Amplify Studio, we can see that we've successfully deployed this model. And if you go to your data, if you click done, you can see we have a URL model here that is deployed. And if you go to content, you would see that we have a table that shows all the items, all the URLs we've stored in this table. And of course, right now we have no URLs to display yet, so there is nothing in this table. But here's what is fascinating about Amplify. Like I told you, Amplify is not reinventing the wheel. Instead, it is taking the best tools from AWS and tailoring it to developers. So if we go to AWS and search for DynamoDB and open it, this is what Amplify is using to store the data the URLs will be creating. If you click on tables, you can see that we have this URL related tables that are going to store our URLs. Same thing goes if we go back and search for AWS App Sync, which is what's responsible for our GraphQL API. Now, another way to look at this thing is if you have any experience with MVCs, if you've built up where you had to write the models, the components, and the views. By the way, if you're aware of this concept, please show of hands in the chat so I will know what it's worth using this mental model to explain what's going on. How many of you have heard of MVCs or understand MVC as an architecture for building apps? Yeah, just emojis in the chat is enough. All right, so let me not make assumptions about what MVC is, but MVC basically allows you to separate how the architecture for your app, where you have the model that represents the data, and that's where you do things like write your SQL query or use ORMs to talk to your database. That's generally where you do database stuff. Then your controller is what handles your API, your business logic. So when you make a request, it hits the controller. The controller generally has a pattern where it receives a request and a response, and uses that request to then talk to the model, which then talks to the database. And then the V is the view, which is your UI. Now, what Amplify is doing for you is taking the responsibility of writing M and C and leaving you to just V. So basically, your database and your controllers are going to be handled by Amplify. Then the view is now your responsibility, which then makes life easier for you, especially if you are a front-end developer. So that said, I've just shown you the M, which is the data, which is DynamoDB. Now the C, which is the controller, is AppSync. And basically, It's an API, it's a GraphQL API that talks to that DynamoDB database. So if I open URL Shortener 3, which is the API that was created by Amplify, it created this in AppSync behind the scene. If we click on queries, you can see we have queries that would allow us to interact with that table. You can also switch to mutation, and you should see how to create a new URL, delete URL, update URL. Same thing for subscription, which is how you do real-time, how you add real-time features to your app. What we care about the most for now is just the queries. So if I click on list URLs, I want to get all the items. I want to get the long and the short URL. And if I run this query, you would see that we get a list of items, in as much as, of course, it's empty, but that's not the point. The point is that we have an API that's actually talking to that database that we've just created. And what's interesting about all of this is that we are yet to write any single code. If you, like you mentioned, for those of you that have written any backend code, you know that this takes a lot of time for you to get to this point where you have an API that is returning a response. It takes a lot of effort to get to this point, but we've literally done nothing. Like I haven't even set up my front. I haven't even finished setting up my coding project yet, and we have an API to work with just by simply going to Amplify and saying, "Hey, I just need a table called URL, and these are the fields that table should have," and that was all. So this is me trying to describe the power of this tool for you, just in case it's not clear to you. And I'm happy to take more questions if anyone is still stuck. But while I'm waiting for questions, I'm going to go to settings. And I'm going to grab this GraphQL endpoint because that is our API endpoint that we're going to use to talk to this API. I'm going to head back to the code editor. I'm going to create a new file at the root of our project that is going to be called .env.local. So you can see the file was added at the root of this next.js project. And inside this project, I'm going to create a GraphQL underscore endpoint variable, which is going to store that URL. And then I'm going to create another variable called GraphQL key, which is going to store our access key or API key. So if you go back to the browser, scroll down, you can see the API key for this AppSync instance, for this AppSync or this URL shortener that is in AppSync. If I copy it and head back to the code editor and paste, now we have a setup locally that allows us, we have credentials set up locally that allows us to talk to that API. And before we start talking to this API, I want to do something quickly. I want to make sure I validate this input so that people don't just dump random strings there as URL. And to do this, I need to create a state. So let me just make this bigger in case you are struggling to see the screen. So I'm going to create a state, and that state is going to be called is URL valid. I want to have a function that updates it as well called set is URL valid. It's going to be a React state, and we're going to initialize it to false. So by default, once the page loads, we just assume that it's invalid because, of course, there's nothing entered in the field yet. Then the next thing we can do is jump to this input. This is the HTML. Let me just put some space here so you can see this clearly. This is the HTML that renders what was seen on the screen in our dev screen. So if I comment this out, you should see that this disappears. Okay, so this is the input field that is responsible for taking the accepting our URL. What I'm going to do is add an onKeyUp event to this input. And I want to make this asynchronous because at the end of the day, we're going to write some code that's going to return a promise, and we're going to call that code inside this function. So let's make it async for now. But if I console.log e.target the value, go back to the browser and look at my console. If I start typing, you can see that the text is appearing in the console. Okay, I hope you guys can see my screen. So if I clear this, and let's do that one more time. So type, and we are getting all of this in the console. I don't want this. I want to only get something in the console when I hit the enter key. So I'm going to go back and check if e.key is the enter key. If it is, then we can log again. So if I refresh and start typing, nothing happens. If I hit enter, it gets logged to the console. Okay, this is the behavior I'm expecting. I installed as a dependency, so I'm just going to do call import is URL. I'm importing from the validator library that was installed when you set up this project. And what this function what I'm going to do with this is URL function is to say if is URL, I'm going to pass it e.target of value, which is the value from the input. If this is a valid URL, then update the state is URL valid and set it to true. But if it's not valid, update the state and set it to false. Now, the reason why I have this state, why I'm managing whether it's valid or not in a state, is because I can then use this state to update my UI and say that if it is URL valid, if the URL is not valid, then I would want to add a red border to this input field. All right, now if I go back to the browser, you can see I'm already getting the red border because this is an invalid URL. If we reload, start typing, we have an invalid URL. But if I go maybe copy the URL from Amplify Studio and paste it, let's see, and paste it and hit enter, for some reason, I'm still getting I want to see why we are still getting the red border. If
Christian,
yes.
We have a question from someone on the YouTube saying, "I'm just joining. Please, can you explain this AWS service again, please?"
All right. Let me let me finish the validation and I will explain it one more. Okay, cool. So the reason why things wasn't working was I was calling is URL valid instead of set is URL valid. So if you get back to the browser now and refresh and paste a valid URL, trying to grab and hit enter, you can see that the red border disappears because this is a valid URL, but nothing visible apart from that changes because, or no obvious behavioral change happens because we haven't handled what should actually happen when you hit enter. And before we do that, let me answer that question from YouTube, which is, what is AWS Amplify? Now, AWS Amplify is a set of tools that allows you to worry less about your backend, about building out your backend API and focus on building your front end and mobile apps. And it does this by leveraging the best tools in AWS. So what that means is that if you go to AWS Amplify and say, hey, Amplify, I would like you to give me a table, and all you just need to do that is to click add model, and a widget like this would appear. You define the fields in the table, and then you save and deploy. And what Amplify is going to do is going to go behind the scene, create the best AWS service for database, the best AWS service for API. Of course, best is subjective to everybody, but at least to me, those are my favorites. And it's going to manage that service for you. So you don't have to go back. You don't have to, if you're not a DevOps engineer, if you're not a cloud engineer, you don't have to fiddle with AWS to understand how to set up an EC2 instance for your API or databases to back up that API. Amplify will do all of these things for you and will give you an API to use to talk to this, for you to interact with your data. And not just that, it has added advantage of authentication, storage, GraphQL, UI libraries, and this allows you to browse through this data, manage your user, and browse through your files. I hope this answered the question. By the way, I need like a minute to take an emergency call, and I'll be back, okay?
Well, Christian is not around. Would you like to, to tell me where you're from in Nigeria? Can you type in inside the chat where you guys come from in Nigeria, or if you're not in Nigeria, which place you come from? I see a lot of people from Lagos.
All right, I'm back. I apologize for that.
That's great. I kept them busy while you were having the call.
Yeah, I had they were sending me my driver's license, and I don't want them to return it because nobody was there to pick it up. So I wanted them to keep it with the concierge or something.
No worries.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Yeah, so let's see, where were we? So I've just explained Amplify for the person on YouTube, for the person that asked the question on YouTube. And so far we've created our database, we've modded our data, we've looked at the API that talks to this data, and we've also gone ahead to touch up our UI a bit so that we can validate the URL that is being accepted from that UI and make sure that it's actually a valid URL before we send it off to our API. So that said, we can then go ahead and start sending that URL to our API. So if I go back to my code editor, let's see. I'll go back to my code editor. I'm going to create a new file in my pages/API folder. And we're going to call this file shorten.js. Now, this is going to be the API handler for whatever request is going to come from the front end. Now, to handle this request, what we need to do is, first of all, create the handler, which is going to be an async function. Async function called handler is going to accept a request and a response. And for now, we're just going to create a response and then send that response back. We're going to send back the status code as well as the data. Of course, I'm here to attach status code and data to this object. And before we can do that, before we can attach it, let's create a shortcode. Let's see how we're going to create a shortcode that is going to represent a long URL. So we need to import a few things from nano ID. We need to import custom alphabet and URL alphabet. Once we have this, we can then create a variable called Shortcode, which is going to call custom alphabet. And custom alphabet is going to take URL alphabet. And the reason why we're doing this is that we're just telling custom alphabet, hey, please ensure that whatever custom alphabet code you generate is going to be URL friendly. Then we want the length to be 5. And then we're going to immediately call the function that custom alphabet is going to return. And calling this function is going to generate a random shortcode. So if you console.log this shortcode and go back to your browser, and let's try to access the API that we've just created. So if we go to localhost/3000/API/shorten and hit enter, of course, we get an error because shortcode, status code and data are undefined. But what's important is that if you look beyond this error and look at your log, we have these 5-character letters that we've just generated, which is XUPQQ. And this is what we're going to send to the database alongside our long URL to represent an entry or a record or URL record. So let's actually attempt sending this thing to the database. And to do that, first of all, we need to get our credentials. To get our credentials, we can create a variable called GraphQL endpoint, which is going to store the GraphQL endpoint we define in our environmental variable. And then we need to create another variable called GraphQL key. It's going to store the variable, the GraphQL key that we stored in our environmental variables. Then we can go ahead and try to make a fetch request. Before we can make that fetch request, let's wrap it in a try-catch block, just in case it fails. Then we can make a fetch request. And that fetch request is going to accept the GraphQL endpoint. And it's also going to accept an options object, which we're going to create in a second. Then assuming that if we're still in the try-catch block at this point, then it was successful. Then we can set the response.data to whatever we get when we pass the response to JSON. And then if anything goes wrong, we can set response.statuscode to 500 and response.data to an object that contains our error. Great. So before we move on, let me just recap what I've just done. Okay, I'm generating custom code using custom alphabet and URL alphabet. I'm making a request using the GraphQL endpoint from our environmental variable, which we copied and pasted into our environmental.env.local file rather. And if it's successful, we send a status code 200 back to the client with the data. If it fails, we send a status code of 500 with an error message back to the client. But then the question is that this is going to, the problem now is that this is going to fail because options is not defined. And it's in the options object that we then tell fetch what payload it needs to send to this GraphQL endpoint. And to define that payload, we can remove this log statement and create the options variable, which is going to be an object like we already agreed on. And the options object is going to have a method, which is telling this fetch request that I want it to be a post, because by default, it would be a GET request. They want to set the headers and pass our API key to this request. And we also need to set content type to application/JSON. Then, as for the body of this request, we need to send a JSON string, an object that contains the query and the variables. I haven't defined queries and variables yet, but query is just going to be a GraphQL variable that looks like the one we saw when we tested out AppSync queries, just like this one. And the variables are going to be parameters that pass that query. So to define this query, we can create a query variable, and we're going to tell VS Code that, hey, this is a GraphQL query using this comment. So VS Code can then do syntax highlighting for us, regardless of the fact that this is a string. We're going to make a mutation, and we're going to call this mutation create URL. It's going to accept an input of type create URL input, which is required. And inside this mutation function, we can call the actual mutation, which is the create URL mutation. And then we can pass it the input that we've gotten from the GraphQL function. And if this is successful, we'd return the long and the short URLs. Now for the variables, we're going to create a variables function, a variables object rather. And whatever we define in this object or in the input of this object is going to be passed into this function when AppSync receives this body. So we want to set the long URL to request.body, because we're going to receive this one from the front end, .long URL. And then the short URL is going to be the shortcode. All right, so this looks like a handful. So I'm going to walk you through it one more time. What I've done here is I'm making a request to a GraphQL endpoint. The GraphQL endpoint receives an options object, and that options object defines what exactly we're sending and how we're sending the information to the GraphQL endpoint. So what we're sending is the body, and how we're sending it is the method and the headers. The headers contains the GraphQL API key and the content type. The body contains the GraphQL query, which just looks like what we already tested in AppSync, as well as the variables. The query is a mutation called create URL, which takes an input, forwards that input to the actual mutation, and if it's successful, it's going to return the long and short URL. And the input that is going to use to mutate is the variables that we're passing to this request. So before we can test this, we need to head to the front end and update our front end code so it knows about this API and talks to this API. So if we go back to the index.js file, we first of all need to create a variable called, or a state called URL to store the URL that is returned when we successfully create a new URL. And this is going to be a React state. We're going to initialize it to a URL object, which is going to have a long value that's empty and a short value that is empty as well at the beginning. Now, once we have this, we can create an asynchronous function called submit URL, and it's going to accept a URL object, just like the one we have here. And what it's going to do is that it's going to try to make a request using fetch to /API/shorten, which is the API we've just created in next.js. We're going to pass it an object, and that object is going to define the method as post. It's going to set the headers and make the content type application/JSON, and the body is just going to be a JSON string of the URL. That's the URL we're receiving from the submit URL function. Now, if this is successful, we can pass the response as JSON, and then we can return the actual object that we've got back from the response. Then, on key up event, what we're going to do, since we know that this URL is valid at this point, what we're going to do is create a variable called URL and call submit URL and pass it an object that contains our long URL, which is going to come from e.target, the value. And then we can update our URL state with whatever we return from this function. And if you remember, what we return from this function is create URL, and create URL is just basically what we return from this mutation, which is the long and short URL as object, contained in an object rather. Now, once we've done all of this, we then need to update this UI section. Right now, it's showing us a dummy text. So we need to update it to, first of all, not even show at all if URL dot short dot length is less than 0. So if this is greater than 0, that's when we can render it. If it's less than or equal to 0, which means we don't have any short URL in our state yet, then please don't render this UI widget. If I save this, you see it disappears because we are yet to shorten the URL. But let's say we've shortened the URL, we can then grab that URL and render the long version here. We can also render the short version here as well. And then we can make this link point to the short version, which we'll get to the reason why I did this in a second. But this domain here is just me hard coding gibberish. It can be anything. It can be whatever domain you end up buying to host your URL shortener. So as a recap, what I've done is in the onKeyUp event, I'm calling submit URL, which would return a URL object, which would take this long URL we get from the form, call an API, submit to the API. The API would respond with a URL, an object containing the long and short URL, and then we update our URL state with that returned URL. And that submit function is just a fetch request talking to the API and sending it the URL and then returning the response. We'll have a state to manage all of this. And once we have the long and short URL, we use our display widget to show the long and the short URL. I know it's a mouthful, and I'm getting to the point where we'll ask where I will take a few questions if I've lost any of you. Now, if I head back to the browser and grab, let's say, this URL, go back to our app and paste it. My fingers crossed that if I hit enter, this is going to work. Yay, it actually worked. So if I go back to Amplify Studio, go to content, and you can see that this is now living rent-free in our database. So we have the long URL, which we just pasted, and we have the short code that represents this URL. And we have an ID for it. We have the time it was created. And if you maybe call the update mutation, you would get the time it was updated as well. So before we go to lengthening this URL, I'm going to stop sharing so you all can see my face. And I'm going to take questions because I feel like this was a lot, and it's completely fine if I lost you somewhere. So feel free to ask me questions and I'd be happy to answer them.
Can I go?
Can I go chat? Yes, please go ahead.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Can I say something for anyone else that wants to ask a question? Maybe you can just raise your hand, and then we can pick person by person, so we don't talk all at the same time.
All right.
All right. Can I still go for it?
Yes, please. Shagun, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I must say this is a handful. I had a few questions I pointed out earlier. I think I dropped on the chat. I noticed you use on key up instead of on change. I was asking if there is a reason why. Then I think the other thing I want to say is not a question, or a sort of I just want to sort of point out the sense I get from what you've done so far. So far, I get that we have only gotten the part where we are generating the short URL.
Okay.
I want to assume that we're also going to touch on how you copy that URL, paste on your client, and then do the redirecting.
Exactly. That's the next thing we'll do. Thank you for pointing that out, but that's the next step as well. And for your question on change versus on key up, honestly, it doesn't matter. I might be wrong. I might be very absolutely wrong. But if I changed to on change, I think it will still have the same behavior. I'm just familiar with on key up because it generally semantically makes sense to me, because I'm like, oh, once my finger leaves a button, I want it to do something. On change makes more sense to me when I'm handling things like radio buttons or checkboxes. When I'm like, okay, I've changed what this thing is supposed to look like. So it's just a semantic thing for me, which might be the wrong answer, because maybe people that have more experiences more experience when it comes to HTML and its the DOM and its events might have a better, more technical answer for you. But for me, it's just vibes. All right, so looks like there are no hands raised. And by the way, if you are wondering about how to raise hands, just leave an emoji that just raises your hand in the text if you have questions. But I'm okay. I can see that Kehinde. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the short demo so far, Christian. It's been very clear. So the question I have is, do we absolutely need to use Amplify or like a database to store anything? Like, is it possible to just save all of the short links in local storage? Would that work as well?
So that would work. That would absolutely work. But then that's a different problem entirely that you're trying to solve, which is maybe you want to build an offline, non-public, non-shareable URL shortener.
Yeah.
What I've just done is take something like Bitly or Rebrandly and strip it down to remove authentication and just show you what they're doing. But your concept makes sense if it's just something personal that you want to use. It's always going to live in your localhost storage. So anytime you go to maybe localhost 5,000 or a particular unique number that you've assigned to be your port for that particular app, that local storage is always going to be there and you can always access it. So it doesn't necessarily have to use all of this. But I don't know if you were there when I introduced this talk and said that my primary goal for this talk was not necessarily to build a URL shortener. A URL shortener was a bonus for you to see how to do make something cool. My goal was to make your life easy by showing you some of the tools that we use at AWS that helps us and our customers move fast when we're building apps. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a spam, but I can see that Channels Television is raising their hand. So please go ahead, Channels.
My apologies. I didn't quite know that I signed in with that account. My apologies. Hi, Kristen. My name is. Yeah.
Hi.
Been following you for quite a while, so well done. I was just wondering, man, this is very much close to the question from the last guest. I suppose that the reason why we're doing this is to understand, what Amplify can do for us, right? So in essence, we are essentially bypassing all the logic. So I would naturally maybe, as you have used Next.js just now, write all the logic, do the GraphQL part, then go ahead on the AWS and set up DynaDB, for instance, probably have an EC2 somewhere and doing all of that. So essentially the AWS Amplify takes away all the stress. So if you build your front end, you can just roll with that. Now, how about scaling out that application? So if you need to scale, how does this work?
That's a very interesting question, and it happens to be something that personally I've got myself roped into these days, where like I'm asking the same question. And it's a very, very, in as much as it's a very interesting question, even when I ask that question to myself, it's a very ambiguous question. And the reason is that we first of all have to define what does scale mean to a customer or to a person. What does it mean that when you say you want to scale? If you have an app that is receiving 10,000 customers every day, you are being backed by AWS Amplify and DynamoDB, which would happily handle that amount of surge on a daily basis at a very low cost. And for that one thing I forgot to mention about Amplify. Amplify is ridiculously cheap. Like when you go to the pricing page and look at how much it costs to set up, to have 1 million requests per day, it's like 1 million requests per day is still less than $1. So the question then becomes, when you say scale, are you asking for if you can
about
handle
compute generally, maybe about compute, for instance?
Okay, exactly. So let's say you have the problem. Let's say you are trying to build something like Conga, right? Or Jumia. I'm using something that we know that's scaled in Nigeria at least. Now, we have to consider a lot of things that goes beyond just the numbers or just the daily access to the website. We have to consider things like, are we measuring any other metrics? Who do we need to be available to, and all of those things. And at this point, you start noticing that for better experiences, maybe you want to start building a microservice that is going to require you to start spinning off EC2 instances. Now, at this point, you have an entirely different problem. You have a problem you have the problem of people that we're not targeting. But who we are targeting, on the other hand, is that you are a developer and you want to build an e-commerce site still at scale of Conga, and you don't want to worry about setting all of these things up. You don't want to worry about setting EC2 instances up. You don't want to worry about setting databases up yourself manually, and you're concerned whether at a large scale, as much as Conga or Jumia is, can AWS Amplify handle the load? And I can confidently tell you yes. And the reason why I'm saying this is because if you're not going to use Amplify at the end of the day, you would still go behind the scene to use AWS features, which is what is backing Amplify. So we just did is take those exciting. What?
So you just abstracted all of that work away, essentially.
Exactly. So we've just abstracted all of that away from the developer, and that is why it's a developer-focused tool. It's an infrastructure for a developer that wants to get moving fast. I can confidently tell you that yes, scale is not always the problem. The problem that I know people might have is not scale in customer numbers, but scale in developer numbers. For example, if you want to become the next Netflix and you want to decentralize and work in microservices, then Amplify is definitely not for you. But if it's whether you are going to end up having 1 million customers and whether Amplify can deal with it, like I told you, 1 million requests per day is still like ridiculously cheap. So that's one exciting thing about Amplify.
Okay, so one final question, Christian. So if you are going to add authentication to this, I mean, as you mentioned, the other very popular, shorteners out there, Bitly and the rest. So you need to sign in, for instance, or sign up, create an account, and then have you remember the URLs that you've shortened in the past. So will it be just as easy as creating a view for sign up, sign in?
Yes.
And then
yes, absolutely.
Of the
Let me just show you real quick. The reason why I had stripped this feature out because it was the original demo was timed, because I wanted to make sure that since this is a workshop, that you all get a chance to ask questions and remote authentication. But if I'm giving this talk on as a conference talk, it has authentication because generally people don't have to ask questions. I can just talk from beginning to the end and show all the features. But yes, if I click on authentication, all I just need to do is already have email enabled. I can add more options: Google, Amazon, phone number, sign in with Apple, set up my password policy, set up my verification message, whether it's SMS or email that people have to receive when they sign up, and click deploy, and that's all. And once you've done this, if you come back to data and click on this model and click on modify authorization rules, it's going to ask you to set up authentication first because we haven't set it up. But once you've set it up, you have a fine-grained option to do things like, hey, I only want signed-in users to access this particular data. Oh, I only want person that created a particular data to access it. Or I only want a group of people that have admin name to access it. So this is where you do your roles now. So authorization rules are just your roles. And this is your authentication here. It's as simple as that, like literally same thing, no code.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, and on the UI aspect, to then make a request that is authenticated, you now have to go to docs.amplify.aws. I hope this is correct. Yes, go to libraries, go to authentication, and you just now have to, let me switch this to React. Nope, JavaScript. You now have to start calling. You have to just do things like import this Amplify library called auth, and then do auth.sign up to give you a username and a password and all of these credentials. You provide your credentials, and then this user is going to contain a JWT token. Then that JWT token is what you will now pass as a header to your request. So if you come back to shorten, so where we are setting the X API key, you will just change this to authorization instead, and then set that JWT here, and then that user is automatically signed in. So I didn't want to add all of this as additional features because of your time, because we're already out of time and we have one more step to go. But yes, if you go through the docs, you see everything you need to seamlessly set up what you're looking for. Okay.
Thank you for taking your time to explain. I appreciate that.
I would ask Christian, is there any place where people can find more information about what you just showed them? Do you have in AWS?
Yes. So it's just these docs that I've just shared right now. So if I want to see what's the best, do I have any recent? Okay, so for now, it's just these docs. If you click on getting started, and make sure you select your language, you can see we support a vast majority of UI frameworks. So if you select, let's say, React or Next or whatever you're using, you can get started. And when you're done getting started, you can then go to libraries and see how to start talking to. First of all, get started. Then Studio will show you how to set up your database and model it, like all of the things we did in Amplify Studio. This is the documentation for it. Then finally, you can then use the libraries to talk to Studio. So I'm going to send this getting started link, and that's the first thing generally people should start with. Let me go the charts and paste this here. Let's see. Cool. All right, let's get going. So we have some time to finish, because I think the next workshop is supposed to be starting anytime soon, and I'm taking their time. So so can you still see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Now what you want to do is that when you click this link here, which basically, if you look at on the bottom left of my screen, it just points to localhost 3000 / that shortcode. What we want to do is to be able to go to that page, and then that page is going to handle our redirection. And to do this, we can go back to our code editor, and we're going to create a new file inside pages called short.js. And if you know anything about next.js, the reason why I've wrapped short in the square bracket is because I'm directly telling next.js that please handle this page as if it's going to receive dynamic parameters. And what that just means is that a normal page would be like this: localhost 3000 / article, right? Or maybe /blog, right? But a dynamic endpoint would be something like /how to cook jollof, or an ID that you can use to fetch a data. So what I'm asking next.js is to create a dynamic page for me, not a static one. And this short text, it's going to grab the parameter from the name of the file. We'll see all of this in a second. All right, so let's start with creating a component called short. This is a React component. The reason why we have to do this is because whether you are redirecting out of this page or whether you're going to stay on this page, it is required for every next.js page to export a component. So if I go back to, if I open on a new tab and open this page, I can see this text short. But we don't want to see this page. What we want to see instead is to immediately redirect the user to a link. So we can do that by exporting a function, export async function get server side props, which is going to receive context. And then to redirect, we just return an object containing redirect, and we'll define a destination. And for now, let's make the destination the home page. If I go back and refresh this page, you see it jumps back to the home page. So if I go to localhost 3000, open this link again in the new tab, it jumps back to the home page. So this is, you can see we're no longer rendering this component, we're no longer seeing this page, but we still need this page because it's a next requirement to export a component from any type of page, whether it's static or dynamic. All right, so this is where we can then start asking our database for the long URL that represents the shortcode that this dynamic URL contains. So what we can do is, first of all, import GraphQL endpoint from, basically create a variable called GraphQL endpoint. It's going to store our GraphQL endpoint credential. And we'll do the same thing for the GraphQL key as well. And then once we have all of this, we can attempt to make a fetch request. So we can do const response it's going to be a response from a fetch request. We're going to pass it the GraphQL endpoint, and it's going to receive an options object, which we're going to create in a second. Then we're going to create a data variable, which is going to store the response that's converted to JSON object. And then finally, we're going to create a URL variable, which is going to store the actual URL. So data.data that's lists URLs dot items. We're going to grab the first item. And then we're going to it redirects to URL.long. Okay. And the reason why I'm doing this is because when you filter, when we define what options is going to be, you're going to see that it's a query that grabs all of the URLs, but then it filters it down to a particular URL, which is the URL that has that shortcode. And it grabs the first item and then redirects to the long version of that URL. So let's define options. We're going to create a variable options. It's going to store the object, and the method is going to be of type posts as usual. We're going to set headers as well. And we're going to define X API key. And that's going to be our GraphQL key like we did previously. And the content type is going to be application/JSON. Then the body is going to be JSON object that contains a query and variables. Now this looks very similar to what we did previously. And it makes sense because we're just making another GraphQL query. So let's define this query as a GraphQL query. So VS Code can highlight it properly. But this time, instead of a mutation, we're going to make a query. And that query is going to be called list underscore URLs. It's going to take an input that's going to be of type model URL filter input. I hope this is correct, but I'll confirm in a second. Let me confirm now before I forget. So if I go back to AppSync, go to queries, go to schema rather, I can see model URL filter input. Yes, this is what I'm looking for. Okay, so then we can actually go ahead and call the actual list URLs query. We're going to filter the query based on the input. And then we're going to return a list of items. And that each of those items is going to contain the long and the short URL. Okay. Then for the input, which we're using as the filter variables, we need to create the variables. It's going to be an object. It's going to have an input. And we're going to say, hey, is the short field, is it equal to context dot params? I hope this is correct. Is this how you get context from, let me see, next JS context params? Yeah, that's correct. So context dot params dot short. What I'm basically saying is, hey, I want you to grab this function is going to receive a context object, which is going to contain our parameters. And the parameter we're looking for is the short parameter. And that is going to represent the shortcode that we attach to the URL. And then we're going to pack this object and load it on the list URL query function, which is going to get forwarded to list URL as a filter. And it's going to make a query that is going to drill down the query down to just a query that has the short that matches this short. So as a recap, then before we move on, or before we test, I'm making a request to a GraphQL endpoint, which takes an options object, returns a response. We grab the URL from the response and redirect to the long version of that URL. And for the options, we've set the method to post. The headers has the API key as well as a content type set to JSON, and the body is a query and the variables. Then finally, we've made a query. And like I said, the query takes an input, which we are defining here. And we are forwarding that input into the actual query, filtering the query based on the input and returning a list of items, which of course is going to be just one item that matches the parameters that were specified in the variables. All right, so let's test this now and see what's going to happen. Fingers crossed it worked, because the demo gods has really been on my side this afternoon. So if I open in a new tab, oops, it worked. I thought that was not going to work. So let's try this one more time. So I'm just going to refresh this page, and let's go to CityJS conference page for Lagos. I'm going to copy this URL. I'm going to paste it. I'm going to hit enter. I'm going to get a short URL. I'm going to right click on this URL. I'm going to open it in a new tab, and it redirected me to CityJS site. Is it time for you to start clapping for me? Feel free to unmute your mic and do so. But yeah, yeah. So we've got a fully functioning URL shortener working, and if you do something like this, feel free to buy a short domain and host it, push it Amplify hosting, and you have a URL shortener, and you can add authentication like our friend suggested as well if you want to protect it and control access to it. So we're going to take one more round of questions as final questions, and then I guess we're done with the workshop.
I will check the YouTube if there's anything there as well and let you know. 1 second.
Got it. Yes, Shegun, go ahead.
I just wanted to know if we'd be able to get this on YouTube, maybe for reference later on.
Yes, it's been streamed. So Aris, can you drop the link in the chat as well?
Yeah, if you go to our YouTube channel, but I will send you the link of the live stream. You can watch it later. And if you have any questions, you can always let us know. Oh, somebody already sent it.
Yeah. I'm also dropping a link in the chat to the repository. It's a public repository for this demo. So if you want to go through the code as well on your own. Then Grace or Shegun, are you done?
Yes, I'm done. Thank you.
Grace is asking, how do we add our custom domain to Amplify hosted app? Cool. So let me share my screen quickly and show you this. Now, what I just need to search for is Amplify hosting custom domain. And this is the first link, literally, is what you need. So what we'll have here is a documentation that shows you how to add a custom domain. So if you click on add a custom, depends on where you bought your domain from. So this is for GoDaddy. But let's assume you've bought your domain from Amazon Route 53. This is just the article that shows you how to set it up. If you bought from GoDaddy, this is the article you need to read. So I'm going to post this link in the chat. So if anyone needs to also set up custom domain for their apps, they can use that. Cool. Are there still any hands that are raised? Any more questions? Is there any question from the YouTube stream, Aris?
No, there isn't any.
Okay, perfect. Cool. Just going to stay silent for 30 seconds to 1 minute, just in case you all are thinking of questions. And after that, we can then conclude.
Thank you so much for the workshop. We should do it again, I think, in London next year.
Yes, definitely. Let's keep doing this. It's exciting.
I have to say that if people want, we have like a big library of videos. And last year you did in London something related with Storybook, right? Design systems.
Yes, exactly. That's that. In London, I demoed the Amplify Studio UI feature, which, by the way, you all, I don't know why I chose this topic over that one, but it's an amazing
feature. I think it was
feature
a really nice feature. That's why I asked you to do it.
Yeah,
so that's so much functionality.
Yeah, but basically, for anyone who wants to know, if you go to Amplify Studio Docs page, I'm going to send the link. Basically, what happens is that you go to Figma. I know there are designers like JK here, so they will give you a design system, and you take the URL and drop it in Amplify Studio. And Amplify is going to do the widest thing you would not have expected. It's going to take that URL, go to Figma, and it's going to convert all the Figma components to React components. And all you just need to do is run a command called amplify pull, and Amplify will create a folder in your React project called UI components. It's going to dump the entire code there for you. And to make things even more interesting, you don't even need to edit the code yourself anymore. You just need to tell your designer, let's say JK, who is a designer, hey, can we add a button to this form? If he adds the button to the design on Figma, the components automatically sync in Amplify. So next time you run Amplify pull, you update the UI again without writing any UI. Yeah, it's really amazing. I wasn't sure of the kind of people that were coming for the workshops. I wanted to do something that was not necessarily only Amplify focused, but show you something they might find cool. But that particular feature of Amplify is amazing. Okay, I think it's my favorite feature. If anyone wants to try it out, let me send the link in the chat.
There is also give me 1 second. I'll try to find the link to that talk, because we had recorded it. So if people want to continue learning more, and this is why CityJS is cool, is because we have a lot of information. It's all for free, and it's for the people that want to learn, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Please share the link in the chat. It's a because I gave this same workshop in London, and Alice has YouTube. Yeah, so they can use that instead.
Sorry, so it takes me a bit, but I will find it. 1 second.
Okay. Cool. And we can also send them a follow-up email with all of these links, just in case you don't find it now. Okay.
I found it. Thank God there is a feature for filtering, so it's easy to type your name.
Yeah.
It brings the video.
Yeah. Okay.
Here it is. Oh, sorry, send it to you. Let me send it to everyone else.
Yeah, you sent it to me. Yeah.
How do I send it to everyone else?
Yeah, let me just send it now. Well, I sent it just just to select the meeting group, and then
I haven't used the Zoom for a long time, so
yeah.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much. There's more workshops. There's one workshop now, but there's gonna be another workshop from Vonage tomorrow about web components. Christian, I need to see you in London and do more stuff with you. And yes, everyone, please. If you want to see more CityJS, all our events are free streamed. So if you want to watch other CityJS conferences, you can do it through our YouTube channel. So keep checking on us, subscribe, and we will deliver more stuff for you. And thanks again. And I'm so happy for Nigeria and everyone, including you guys. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.